22nd of May, 6th Sunday of Easter. Sermon on John, chapter 14, verses 23 to 29. Acts, chapter 16, verses 9 to 15. And Revelation, chapter 21, verses 10, 22 to chapter 22, verse 5. We are a few weeks away from Pentecost and Trinity Sunday, and our Gospel reading today gives us some pointers to both those high spots in the Church's year. These words were spoken on Jesus last night with his disciples. His arrest and death were imminent. Judas had already left to betray Jesus, and the 11 who remained were about to turn into a bunch of frightened, dispersed and confused men. And so Jesus was seeking urgently to convey to them that they were not going to be left alone. Help was coming. Teaching about the Holy Spirit had not been plentiful in the Scriptures up to this point, but now he is clearly described and his purpose delineated. First of all, Jesus states that for any who love him and follow his teaching, the Father and he himself will come and make their home with them. The disciples might have wondered how this could be, but then Jesus spoke of a counselor or comforter whom God would send to be with them forever. This would be the Spirit of truth, the Holy Spirit, who would live with them and in them. Jesus would be leaving his disciples. They would see him no more once he'd returned to heaven. But they would not be alone, for the Holy Spirit would be their possession, with them constantly, to guide and help them. It would be the Spirit who would teach them and remind them of all that Jesus had said to them. In these words we can glimpse the complexity of the Holy Trinity. That although Jesus was leaving the earth, he would be with his disciples still, because the Spirit would be with them. The Spirit has exactly the same qualities as Jesus and the Father. Together they are one God, but three persons. The Holy Trinity is beyond our understanding, but it is nevertheless an inescapable teaching from the Scriptures. And if we have received the Spirit, and all true Christians have, then we have God living with and in us. It is the Spirit who sanctifies us, shapes us to be more like Jesus. We can look back over our Christian lives and see how, over the years, we have been transformed. We're not perfect yet, but we're getting there. It was also the Holy Spirit who enabled the followers of Jesus to recall and write down his teachings. The Gospel accounts were written decades after the events they describe, but the Spirit enabled writers like John and Matthew to remember and record their experiences of Jesus and his teaching. Peter didn't write a Gospel, but it's believed that he shared what he knew with Mark, who wrote it all down. And Luke gained much of what he knew from Paul, who, though not one of the first apostles, came to faith and was filled with the Spirit, so that he learned Christian teaching and fitted it with what he already knew from the Hebrew Scriptures and the law, so that he carried out a very effective ministry among Jews and Gentiles, and wrote letters to the early churches which have formed the basis of much of our Christian doctrine. To return to our passage, Jesus promised that through the Holy Spirit, his followers would have his peace in their hearts and had no need to be afraid. They were about to be very afraid, of course, when Jesus was arrested, but that would all change after the resurrection, and most particularly after Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit fell in power on all of them, and the church was born. In the book called The Acts of the Apostles, we can read of how the early disciples took the message of Jesus across the known world. But really, the book should be called The Acts of the Holy Spirit, because without him nothing would have happened. In our reading from Acts, we see the Holy Spirit in action, directing the early disciples into effective ministry, paving the way for them, opening up possibilities, preparing people's hearts and minds to hear the gospel. The Spirit directs Paul to Macedonia with the vision of a man begging for help. Paul and his companions at once prepare for the journey that will lead them to visit towns such as Philippi and Thessalonica, where we know they established churches because we can read Paul's letters to those churches in our New Testament. In this passage we see Paul at work in Philippi and having success with a group of women, including Lydia, who not only believed but welcomed the missionaries into her home. When we listen to the prompting of the Holy Spirit, we can find ourselves stepping out of our comfort zone. Paul often encountered opposition and persecution. He does later in Philippi. But sometimes even that has an outcome that furthered the kingdom. So you must listen to next week's sermon to see what exactly did happen in Philippi. Finally, in our reading from Revelation, we have a vision of the bride of Christ, the New Jerusalem descending from heaven. Theologians will disagree about the interpretation of this passage, and I'm reluctant to be too dogmatic, especially about any reading from Revelation, which is a complex prophecy given to one man. The ways in which God has revealed himself to his people over the centuries vary hugely in detail. The God who appeared to Moses in a burning bush seems rather different from the God revealed in splendour to Ezekiel, or attended by angels when he appeared to Isaiah, or who spoke in a still small voice to Elijah. So we shouldn't be too prescriptive about God or try to tie him down to particular details. And the same is true of this vision in Revelation. What is clear, though, through all this glorious hyperbole about an enormous city, 1,400 miles high and made of pure gold and gemstones, is the wonder of our salvation, of the overwhelming presence of God with his people, the refreshing waters of life, the healing of the nations, and the everlasting illumination that comes from the Lord. It was for our salvation that Christ came to earth and died. It was for our salvation that he sent the Holy Spirit to continue his work. It was for our salvation that he revealed God to us. In this continuing season of Easter, may we hold our salvation dear and worship the God who wrought it for us.